Do you love playing Rogue, but find that he does undesirable levels of damage? Are you one of these individuals who simply plays Rogue and then complains that they do no damage and that Rogue is bad? Do you want to feel like a true damage demon when you play Rogue? Then this video is for you. In this guide, I will show you how to build a Rogue in order to deal real damage. You will turn from a lowly Rogue Gooner to a Sigma Chad that simply no-diffs everyone in his path. At first, you might wonder why I flashed those sets in your face and called them lowly Gooners, but by the end of the video, you will easily be able to tell why those sets don't work. Rogue has been a laughingstock of DPS for so long. Then, he received a class rework in the ROTMG of 2024, which gave him two new effects, Lethal Strike and Sneak. Even after a full year of this character being reworked, many people still don't understand how he works, while others hold mixed opinions.
Isn't bad. I think it's pretty good. Considering if you're using like certain robes, or not robes, but certain cloaks. It's probably higher in the mid area, top 10 at least, bare minimum. Yeah, it does a lot of DPS with the right setup. The right setup, it can do a lot.
I don't know. Rogue's pretty solid. With the right stuff, he can do a lot of damage. Like, I feel like he's kind of slept on. He's not as good as, say, like a ninja samurai, but he can hold his own.
Assuming Necromancer's the lowest DPS and Samurai was the highest, where would I place Rogue? Rogue is actually pretty good damage. He's not like a lot of consistent damage, but he has pretty good burst potential. Compared to the other classes, let's see. I would, with his rework, it's hard to say. I would put him like maybe if a Sork was single target damage, maybe around there.
No longer will this be the case, for this guide shall clear up misconceptions and clearly demonstrate Rogue superiority and firmly place him in his rightful place at the top of the DPS ladder. To start our journey to understanding Rogue, we begin with the basics, his brand new effects. Lethal Strike is an effect that happens after the player breaks their Sneak. Sneak, for the most part, is just a renamed invisibility. It's simply an invisibility that can be broken by the player rather than ending after a set time. Once invisibility ends, the player is granted Lethal Strike for a set duration, which is on average 2.4 seconds. Most cloaks will grant you 2 additional Arcana-like shots that will shoot out during the Lethal Strike duration, doing the listed cloak's damage. If you look at the description of a cloak's Lethal Strike damage, you will find a raw number and a percent number based on the enemy's defense. Both of these numbers scale off a stat depending on the cloak. For tiered, this would be Wisdom. On average, each scaling stat obtained will boost the cloak's raw Lethal Strike damage by 3 and their percent scale damage by 0.5. Percent damage scaling is additional added damage that allows Rogue's Lethal Strike to be less affected by enemy defense. For instance, say the percent damage of your cloak is 50. Now you attack an enemy with 100 defense. Since you have 50% defense damage scaling, you will have an additional 50 damage added to your Lethal Strike. So, assuming you deal 100 raw damage, you will be doing 50 Lethal Strike damage to that target, since 100 minus 100 plus 50 equals 50, which helps to ensure that Rogue's Lethal Strike damage isn't completely nullified when facing enemies with higher defense pools. Another thing to note about defense scaling damage is that it is in reference to the enemy's current defense. As such, if the enemy is armor broken, they will register as 0 defense. But you will not do negative damage if the target has 0 defense and is exposed, since exposed simply acts as a plus 20 damage during damage calculations. There is one important thing that must be understood. The damage boost of Lethal Strike isn't just the 2 additional shots, but rather the damage of Lethal Strike is also applied to each shot of your weapon. This is very important to understand, as it will help you with creating a rogue that will actually scale well with its Lethal Strike as it is meant to, as opposed to just running anything. What does this mean? Assume we are using the same numbers as before, 100 Lethal Strike damage and 50% defense damage scale. Now I have 3 different daggers, a regular tier 14, a Corruption Cutter, and an Archangel's Judgment. Upon Lethal Strike activation, I will receive the 2 additional shots that deal 100 damage and have a 50% defense damage scale. But that damage is also being added to each shot of my weapon, and the percent defense damage scale property also applies as well. For the tier 14 dagger, I am receiving the 2 shots plus adding my Lethal Strike damage to the dagger's shots, so in total my lethal is increasing my damage by 300. But for my Corruption Cutter, since I have 2 shots, the lethal is increasing my damage by 400, due to the fact that the Lethal Strike extra damage is applied to each and every shot of your weapon. And going further, we can use Archangel's Judgment or Fractal Blades to increase our damage by 600. This is why weapons with more shots scale way better for Rogue than single shot weapons, since you can multiply the amount of added Lethal Strike damage by using a weapon with more shots. Another thing to take note of is the fire rate of a weapon. The additional 2 shots that come out during Lethal Strike also scale with how fast you shoot, up until a certain point, so you should aim to use weapons with higher fire rates and or add more dexterity to your character to help boost DPS as well, since it will not only boost how many of the additional projectiles you fire, but it will also help you shoot your weapon faster. This should not be overdone, however, since the extra shots do cap out at a certain point. A final note for Lethal Strike is the fact that there is MP drain per projectile, and the standard is 2 MP per projectile, so if you're firing very fast, the MP drain can be quite high. This is another reason as to why we would want to consider scaling the raw damage rather than focusing on dexterity. After obtaining the knowledge of how Lethal Strike works, we may now discuss how we want to play Rogue. If we take the class in its most basic form, we have an ability which grants us a large DPS boost for 2.4 seconds and has a 5.5 second cooldown, which is roughly 45% Lethal Strike uptime. One must not forget that even though Rogue now has the capability for high damage, his base stats are still very bad since they were only slightly buffed when the rework dropped. As such, we want to scale our Lethal Strike as much as possible to act as our main DPS. This can be done in multiple ways. We can use higher fire rate weapons, we can use higher shot count weapons, we can add more dexterity to help us shoot faster, or we can scale our cloak based on the stat it scales from. For the most part, the best way to boost your damage is by adding more shots, and by increasing your Lethal Strike damage through scaling the cloak directly. On average, one stat of cloak scaling will be a DPS increase of approximately 2 times more than adding 1 dexterity. And due to the fact that Lethal Strike is a direct number application to each of your shots and doesn't scale with attack, trying to boost DPS through adding more attack is practically pointless and a waste of time. Say, for example, we want to use a defense build rogue. What we would want to do here is obtain our defense scaling cloak, obtain a desirable weapon with a high shot count, and then obtain an armor and ring which will grant us as much defense as possible. This is the best possible way to increase the DPS of our setup. Now, what if I told you that we can go further? Remember how I told you that every cloak in the game grants us sneak or invisibility? And how Lethal Strike is obtained when sneak is broken? Well, activating Lethal Strike is only dependent on what cloak you have equipped when said sneak is broken. What do I mean by this? We shall take advantage of this mechanic by grabbing ourselves a Cloak of the Planewalker. See, this cloak teleports the user wherever their cursor is pointing, and in the past, this cloak had a cooldown. Currently, however, the cloak has no cooldown, as well as granting the player sneak. This means we can use Planewalker, swap to our main cloak before the 1 second time frame for sneak to break, and then obtain Lethal Strike. By doing this, we completely skip the 5.5 second cooldown of our cloak while still having the benefit of the 2.4 second Lethal Strike. And we can simply just repeat this process in order to keep Lethal Strike active as much as possible. Now we've gone from a 45% uptime to roughly 80 to 90% uptime depending on how good our timing is. Timing is important when using this plane swapping tech, since if you attempt to apply Lethal Strike again while Lethal Strike is active, basically just breaking sneak while still having Lethal Strike, the timer of your Lethal Strike will not extend further, as it is not a status effect that can simply be refreshed even if it's active. So, when using a Planewalker, you should aim to have your sneak break at a timing when your Lethal Strike would end in order to keep it as close to true 100% uptime as possible. Before we go into enchantments, I will discuss some builds in regards to what stats one would aim to scale. The main four being Attack, Wisdom, Defense, and Vitality. For Attack, we have the Cloak of Bloody Surprises. For Wisdom, we have Tiered Cloaks, Cloak of the Deep, Cloak of Refraction, and Ghastly Drape. For Defense, we have Cloak of the Mad God and Cloak of Cubic Enigma. Finally, for Vitality, we have Cloak of the Darkened Sun and Vampiric Cape. When it comes to scaling, all these cloaks will share similar properties aside from Bloody Cloak, which has a slightly different scaling which results in it only being useful in a niche category. The other three stats all work the same with different numbers. Starting from the most basic and most straightforward stat options are Defense and Vitality. Our Defense Cloak options of Cubic and Mad Cloaks both start scaling above 25 defense, with their flat numbers being 65 damage and 45% defense damage. They both scale by plus 3 damage and plus 0.5% defense damage per defense over 25, with Cubic giving plus 5 and Mad God giving plus 6 defense on equip. On paper, these both hold the exact same damage numbers, so we'd expect them to have the same DPS. However, the Mad God Cloak has a very slow Lethal Strike fire rate, which means the extra projectiles come out far less frequently than the average cloak. This puts Cubic Enigma ahead in terms of DPS. The Mad God Cloak has another finicky issue with it. It is the fact that it does not have the capability of breaking its own sneak, meaning you are forced to be invisible for 3 seconds before your lethal applies. This can be circumvented by plane swapping, since the sneak obtained from Planewalker can be broken. But as an item raw, it has difficulty applying its damage in a fast and convenient manner. Another point for Cubic. Its only upside is the fact that it grants Armored, so it works well as a tank item. Upon using Cubic, a small cube is spawned that follows the player with a 4.5 tile AoE that does 600 armor pierce damage every 0.4 seconds up until invisibility ends, meaning if you break your invisibility, the cube is gone. There is a method to have the cube up while also having Lethal Strike, but I personally don't find much use in this since it will force you into a 5.5 second cooldown. The vitality options are Cloak of the Darkened Sun and Vampiric Cape. The Darkened Sun starts scaling past 24 vitality and gains plus 3 damage and plus 1% defense damage for every vit above 24, with a flat start of 60 damage and 45% defense damage. The Vampiric Cloak starts scaling past 50 vitality and gains plus 4 damage and plus 1% defense damage for every vit above 50, with a flat start of 55 damage and 40% defense damage. Vampiric Cape overall isn't super worth, as it starts scaling after a very high vit number and doesn't have additional shots that fire during the lethal timer, so the Darkened Sun Cloak will be a far better option. As for the Darkened Sun Cloak, it holds the unique property of bleeding when the additional shots land. The overtime bleeding doesn't seem to scale with vit, but raw it seems to do around 250 to 300 extra DPS in accordance with my testing, assuming you land both additional shots to stack maximum bleed. This bleed also seems to have about a 2.5 second lifetime. Due to the fact that it is obtained from Shards of the Intern, you will find it difficult to obtain high slots on this item, which makes it very enchantment unfriendly. For our attack option, we only have Cloak of Bloody Surprises. This cloak is unique as it is the only cloak that does not scale its flat damage and only scales its percent defense damage. It holds the highest flat damage of 150 and has a somewhat low flat of 35% defense damage, but it holds a plus 2% defense damage scaling for every attack above 55. On top of this, the cloak gives plus 30 attack and minus 40 speed upon lethal activation and holds a 3-second lethal strike timer. Essentially, this cloak's entire identity is to deal very high damage to targets with high defense. However, there is a reason why this build doesn't work very well. First, if the enemy is armor broken, then you obtain 0 benefit from the high percent defense damage. Secondly, at the absolute highest, you can get around 284% defense damage increase with the best setup, which, even on a high defense target like Oryx 3 after Celestial, which is a 75 defense enemy, you are only adding 213 lethal strike damage on top of your flat 150. This is 363 total overall damage, which is pretty good. But a maxed out defense build does 420 flat damage with around 103% defense damage, meaning it doesn't require a high or low defense target to deal massive damage. For these reasons, I cannot recommend the Cloak of Bloody Surprises as a DPS option. Finally, we come to the Wisdom Cloaks. All Wisdom-related cloaks start scaling above 34 Wisdom regardless of what item it is. They simply vary in scaling. Tiered cloaks have varying number scaling, so I will flash a table from Realmeye instead. Pause if you wish to see the scaling numbers. As for our UT and ST options, we have Ghastly Drape, Cloak of the Deep, and Cloak of Refraction. Starting in order, we have Ghastly Drape. This is a cloak that scales plus 4 damage and plus 0.5% defense damage per whiz above 34, and is the second cloak in the game with the highest raw damage scaling per stat. But it starts at a raw 20 damage and 30% defense damage. This cloak also holds some unique properties. The first being that it is the only cloak in the game with a 5-second lethal strike timer, which is the longest in the game. Second, this cloak's extra shots are not like the standard shots of other cloaks, but rather you shoot 6 shots that start from the player and go outward, rotating half a circle. So at range, you can hit only 3 shots max. These extra projectiles are also unique in the fact that they have their own flat damage of 50 to 150, unlike other cloaks which have the flat damage of lethal strike only. So the extra shots of the drape are 50 to 150 on top of the added lethal strike damage. Due to the high scaling of drape, it takes about 94 wisdom for it to catch up to the lethal strike damage of tier 7. On a rogue with 86 wisdom, the drape lost to tier 7 with plane swap by about 10,000 damage at range. But when EPing with drape, it completely beat out tier 7 even with plane swapping. Overall, this is one of the easiest to use cloaks for its damage, and if scaled properly can be the highest damage cloak in the game. And due to its 5-second lethal strike timer, it doesn't require plane swapping for a high lethal strike uptime. Best main cloak choice I can recommend. As for the other two, Cloak of Refraction and Cloak of the Deep, I cannot recommend these as much. Cloak of Refraction scales plus 1 damage and plus 1% defense damage per whiz above 34, with 40 raw damage and 30% defense damage. But it doesn't pair well with plane swapping, since you need to use the cloak itself to obtain the decoy and the minions. One upside to this cloak is that the lethal strike shots hit multiple targets with a slight boomerang property, but its damage is too low for this to be viable. Cloak of the Deep is a unique cloak. It doesn't grant invisibility in any way. It scales plus 0.5 damage and plus 0.5% defense damage with a raw 60 damage and 10% defense damage. This is the lowest scaling in the game, on top of the fact that this cloak does not operate the same way other cloaks do. See, the lethal strike applied from this cloak does not apply to your weapon, meaning you lost the entire point of rogue. On hold, you fire a barrage of bubbles in front of you, draining 50 mana per second. You are required to be at around 2 tiles to hit all shots. It drains MP that cannot restore during its use, weakens you on use, and doesn't apply lethal to your weapon's shots. This cloak, by far, is the most overrated cloak in the game, and I'm sick of hearing everyone compliment this cloak. It really is just bad. Scaling this cloak properly to its maximum potential is at most 50 to 60% DPS of a tiered cloak scaled properly. I cannot recommend either Cloak of Refraction nor Cloak of the Deep as DPS cloaks. The final portion of this video will involve what types of enchants we'd want to have on our cloaks. The enchantment system is quite new, so this will be useful for the time being. For all items in our setup, we'll want to have some stat mods to increase the damage of our lethal strike proc, since this will prove to be the best way to increase our DPS overall. This will involve searching for a unique stat boost mod or a relative stat boost mod, like relative defense, and a trade-off mod. Stats that I would advise having as the one you lose with the trade-off is anything except dexterity or speed, and maybe life if you're concerned about survivability. Normally, I'd never advise having a trade-off enchant that decreases your attack. However, due to how Rogue works, losing some attack has an almost zero effect on Rogue's DPS, and as such it is not troll to run, for example, Wisdom minus attack trade-off 4. For our weapon, the main thing that we want to run is Flurry of Blows. This is an enchant that grants 35% fire rate to our weapon while decreasing the damage by 20%. Once again, since Rogue doesn't actually care about how much base damage our dagger does, but rather relies on fast firing and high shot counts, this will be a massive DPS increase. Due to Flurry of Blows being a unique, it prevents you from getting a unique stat mod increase enchantment, so you will have to settle with relative plus trade-off enchants for the weapon. An enchant we want to run on our Planewalker would be MP cost reduction to help us use it more, while for our main DPS cloak, we want stat mod multiplier. What this does is it increases the amount of scaling we get by up to 15% at max level. Instead of receiving 3 damage per stat scaled, we will now receive 3.45 damage per stat scaled, which is a huge DPS increase. Other enchants that are quite worth if you get them are MP regen mods, damage resistance, and HP regen modifiers. If your items have the extra slots to accommodate more than just the required stat mods for increasing DPS, you can still indirectly increase your DPS further by obtaining more MP or HP regen mods. The MP drain from lethal can get quite hefty, and constantly using Planewalker costs a lot, so it will help keep lethal uptime. And HP regen helps you stay high HP more often, so you won't worry as much about dying. This is the theory crafting breakdown for how you would want to set up your items and their enchants if you plan to increase your DPS most efficiently. And it's up to you to figure out what items you wish to obtain for your given build. Rogue is a class which is extremely underrated in its current state due to how it's been perceived by the Realm community for so long. To be honest, it really doesn't deserve the dislike and hate it gets after the rework. Rogue holds very high DPS potential and a unique playstyle that doesn't follow the simple add DPS stats and go burr, but rather challenges the common practices and forces players to become more crafty with how they will actually achieve their damage. Some aspects, such as using high shot count and high fire rate for your best DPS, while not caring about your attack stat or raw damage of your weapon regardless of enemy defense, is unheard of. And yet for Rogue, this is completely normal. This is the furthest extent of my knowledge in regards to Rogue, so I hope this was informative. Let me know if you guys would like to see more endgame guides in regards to dungeons, classes, or just general gameplay. Until next time.